afternoon, everybody. It's 3 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. Good afternoon, everybody here, and to everybody joining us online, and welcome to this Migration Policy Centre seminar. My name is Caitlin Proctor. I'm a part-time professor here at the MPC, and I'm really delighted to be chairing this seminar and to be joined by three wonderful colleagues. Rizza Cases, Leila Giannetto and Marta Kindler. Leila and Marta we have online. And together, the three of us are working on a Horizon Europe funded project, which is hosted here at the EY, titled Protecting Irregular Migrants in Europe. A little bit of housekeeping just for our colleagues online before we start. So my colleagues will present for 20-25 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat, which we'll be monitoring online, but there'll be time to raise hands for the discussion afterwards. So before we turn to the presentation, let me just introduce my three colleagues. Okay. So to my right, Rizza Cases is a research fellow at the Institute for Sociology of the Slovak Academy of Sciences and affiliate researcher at the Center of Migration Research at the University of Warsaw. She obtained her PhD in sociology and social research from the University of Trento here in Italy in 2018. While her previous work centers on Filipino migrants working in the care sectors of New York and London, her current research projects examine Filipino migration in Central and Eastern Europe. She's PI of the Next Generation EU-funded project Recruitment, Context of Reception, and the Integration of Third Country Nationals in Central and Eastern Europe, with a case study on Filipino migrant workers in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. She is an affiliate of the Center of Migration Research at the University of Warsaw and is a part of the Polish team working on PRIME, our project Protecting Irregular Migrants in Europe. Marta Kindler, who joins us online, is a sociologist and assistant professor at the Center of Migration Research and Institute for Social Prevention and Resocialization at the University of Warsaw. Her research focuses on the role of social networks in migration and knowledge production in migration studies, and she's currently a board member of the IMISCO Standing Committee Reflexivities in Migration Studies. Marta is the co-editor of the book Ukrainian Migration to the EU, Lessons from Migration Studies, and author of the book A Risky Business, Ukrainian Migrant Women in Warsaw's Domestic Work Sector. And finally, I'm delighted to introduce you to our colleague here from the MPC, Leila Giannetto, who is a research fellow here at the EY working on PRIME. She previously contributed to several EU-funded projects, including the Horizon 2020 Holcom project, and has worked with FIERI, IOM, CPMR, and others. She holds a PhD also from the University of Trento, and her research focuses on Frontex and fundamental rights at the EU borders, civil society organizations' role in migration and asylum governance, refugee reception and integration, and most recently, the living and working conditions of foreign workers in Italy. So I'll hand over to Rizza now to start our presentation, and then we're going to move to Marta and Leila online, and then bring it back to the room for discussion. Rizza, thank you very much.
Okay, good afternoon, both of those who are here and those joining us online. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to share one of the preliminary findings from our work package. We will try to make this work in a hybrid format. So, but first let me introduce very briefly PRIME, which is Protecting Irregular Migrants in Europe. With PRIME, we aim to understand the diverse experiences of irregular migrants, the institutional context that shape those experiences and responses, the interests and attitudes of host communities, and the context-specific policy tools needed to respond more effectively to the challenges faced by people living in situations of irregularity. So we have several partners, and if you want to know more about PRIME, you can check out our website. Next slide, please. In order to answer our research question, we rely on both large-scale surveys and qualitative interviews with irregular migrants, employers, policy actors, interest groups, and residents across 8 countries. and we are focusing on 4 employment sectors: agriculture and food processing, elderly care, waste management and recycling, as well as restaurants and gastronomy. Right. Before we get into the main topic of the paper we are developing, we will first introduce our work package, which mainly aims to answer how workers access work opportunities and experiences and experience working in living conditions within the context of precarity and irregularization in different European countries. As with Prime, it relies on comparative analysis, not only across countries, but also across statuses and across the employment sectors. Right. So when we say irregular migrants or irregularization, we define it as having no, sorry. So in the project, we define irregularized status as the lack of the legal right to stay, but we also focus on statuses such as what we call semi-regular or semi-compliance. So these are those with residence permits, but working without a contract or in violation of the terms of their residence permits, or third country nationals in between visas. So we look at not only legal status, but intersecting also with work statuses, which can be irregular or regular at a particular point in time. Marta will discuss the complexity of statuses later on, but let me first introduce you to the actual focus of today's seminar, which is on intermediaries and brokers. Next slide, please. Basically, we found the salience of this particular theme in our preliminary data analysis, and it's for that reason that we aim to explore this further. And if we look at the brokerage, we know that it has the dual aspect of both serving as a resource for migrants when we apply it in migration research, but also at the same time, we know that it breeds exploitation and can exacerbate existing inequalities. Next slide, please. We find the research on intermediaries and brokerage practices within the literature on migration infrastructure, for instance, and migration industries. But if we notice, these literature focuses more on the sending country, particularly in Asia, and on the facilitating function of brokers and intermediaries pre-migration. We are more closer to the work of Ambrosini on intermediaries within the context of irregular migration, wherein he explored different activities related to intermediation and the various actors involved throughout the migration process, meaning to say that not only from travel and border crossing, but also to insertion within their experiences of insertion in receiving societies and settlement experiences. We will not go over this, but this is just to show preliminarily in the literature what sort of activities relate to intermediation, the more, say, positive aspect of it, connecting migrants or matching migrants with opportunities for travel, work, and settlement. But also at the same time, it can also rely on semi-legal or illegal supply of resources on demand by irregular migrants. We will explore this further with the data that we collected, which Leila will discuss. But first, let me turn over to Marta to discuss the data that we collected and also to expound more on the complexity of statuses that we find in our data. Thank you. Marta?
Thank you very much, Rizza. As Rizza has mentioned, we will focus today on in-depth interviews, that were collected in focus countries and in the sectors she has mentioned with migrants who are in irregularized processes. So we had also regular migrants with a regular status who were used more as a control group. What we focus today is actually in particular 48 in-depth interviews, but as you can see, we have collected over 230 interviews, out of which the majority actually have experienced some form of semi-compliance, and over 90 interviewees have been in this process of irregularization. Just a few words about the challenges we have experienced, like methodological challenges in collecting this data. I mean, this is a hidden population, a difficult to reach population. So, of course, we are very much aware that we have not managed to actually reach those most vulnerable. So, yes, those who have no connections to service provider or civil society, or who are not well networked. In addition, some of the sectors proved to be very, very difficult to enter. So, for example, as you see, we have less interviews in waste management. And then we had country specificities as well, because of certain things occurring, as for example, in Poland, there was as a growing anti-immigrant discourse, but there were also some political events concerned with the visa scandal. And also in Sweden, we have the whole time, yes, high levels of control. So in general, people were afraid actually to participate in the research, not only on the migrant side in the case of Poland, for example, but also employers who were not that eager to speak to us. And last but not least, another challenge was the fact that the people who we researched, in some cases, did not know actually what their status is. And following on that, we need to underline that the status of stay, or maybe when we should say statuses, plurally, of stay, is very, very complex. First of all, because it changes multiple times in the experience of even one person, yes? So those people whom we spoke to at the moment of the interview, who were, for example, had a regular status, actually in the past had been experiencing irregular or semi-regular statuses. Second of all, they also recall that at the beginning, for example, when they entered the country, they were not even aware that, as they referred to themselves, that they were illegal. Yes, they thought that their papers were being processed by the intermediary mainly, but sometimes as well by the employers, while these papers were not processed. And then finally, I think something we need to keep in mind is that when reading the material, we had a very strong impression that the people, they are trying the whole time to keep their head above the water. So they're trying to comply the whole time with regulations. Yes. So that means basically that they were living under constant stress, constant pressure, trying to keep the documents somehow right. That means as well very limited exit strategy from exploitative work conditions, because this work actually allows them somehow to remain regular. So this we have to keep in mind. Another thing I think that is important as well, that we found actually quite a lot of similarities across the statuses of stay. So many of our interviewees, whether actually regular or at the moment of the interview or irregular, they actually, upon entry, in general, they had some documents to enter. And so in that sense, they had some document allowing them to basically stay in that country for the moment, whether it was a tourist visa or a work permit that they overstayed. But so that was similar. Similar were also actually the methods they reached the labor market. And even if they were using formal intermediaries, yes, for example, they were using placement agencies, this did not guarantee them the fact that the job was decent, well paid, that they got actually the papers right. And what is important as well, they had very little choice then when what type of job they will be doing. Yes, they were basically sent to a particular factory and they had to work there. Well, they used, of course, as well, all the groups used informal, practically intermediaries, even if only for recommendations or references. Quite a few of these informal intermediaries came from the migrant communities, which meant as well often that, as networks do, they channel them more to those so-called migrant jobs, yes, 3D jobs, and so on. Some, of course, quite a few of them used as well more individualized strategies, and in general, the intersections of all these three forms of finding work. Initially, all of the people had basically difficulties accessing work that had decent working conditions. That was very much linked to language, to the fact that they immediately had to start working to have some financial support, the fact that they even if they knew that they had temporary, for example, work permits, they had to get their documents sorted. They had to get whatever their diplomas nostrified in terms of more skilled people, people with more skills. What is important as well, that all of them, especially at the beginning, experience precarity. So precarious work arrangements were not present among people who had regular status and over 10 years of migration experience. Multiple of our interviewees experienced dependency on employer or unemployment to actually regularize their status, to renew their legal status, and their actual stability of work was very, very limited. Yes, so they had to shift from job to job, from place to place, from company to company. Their payment very often was used as a form of disciplining them. Yes, so they were being not paid or paid less, and they were expected to work even in case of sickness. And finally, the last thing that was very similar for many was the poor, actually unstable, and at moments very unsafe living conditions that they did experience. Now, I give a hand over to Leila with particular already examples from the different countries when it comes to actually employment, intermediary scams, and disappearing employers.
Thank you so much, Marta. And yes, I'll be brief in the interest of time. We have just gathered a bit of examples from 4 countries that we've started to analyze interviews more in depth. And so we have Italy, Poland, UK, and Austria as 4 countries that we've analyzed. We've done the first round of analysis of interviews from migrants that we've interviewed in those countries. And so we saw this trend emerging in terms, again, of scams being something that all of migrants, irrespective of their status, irrespective of the sector they live in, they work in, and the country they live in, they experience over their life. And so for Italy, we have identified cases of people being scammed or perceived to being scammed by lawyers. We've seen also migrants perceiving the bosses or work intermediaries as the scammers. I want just to highlight here that on also private intermediaries and related scams and perceived scams in Italy, Fabio De Blasis, who I think is also here online, and Paola Bonizzoni have presented already during a seminar at the EUY their work. So we're just adding to also their case, their studies in Italy. And so we've seen, as I was saying, lawyers that maybe don't have somehow don't file the right documents at the right time for people to become regularized, and bosses or work intermediaries that just don't do things right. So the workers feel, even if they have a right to stay, so they're regular, they still don't get contracts that reflect what they've been working. Next slide, please. Still in Italy, we've seen also perceived scams from public officials, including police offices and from street level bureaucrats. And the feeling is that whenever they're faced with a police officer in the police office who's dealing with their documents, migrants feel that their rights are not respected, and so their chances of becoming legal are very low, because they always have to do an extra mile to get their documents in order. And next slide, please. In Poland, we just move to Poland very quickly. In Poland, we've seen instead that it's mostly temporary employment agencies that migrants perceive as the scammers when they try to access work. And basically, some of them just think, for example, have examples from Filipino workers in food processing and the restaurant sector in Poland. And they arrive to Poland, they're initially convinced that the intermediary who places them will be responsible for getting their papers right. And basically, in some cases, our interviewees got papers that the intermediary claimed to be work permits, but it turned not to be so. And in other cases, they get the documents just like too late. This kind of issues with temporary employment agencies, which are supposedly the ones that should support migrants in the regularization process. And then next slide, please. Also in the UK, we see that work intermediaries and again, agencies play a crucial role in this sense. And so it's not only the bosses somehow are, the employers are disappearing, while work intermediaries become the ones that seem to get the blame from migrants for their conditions and for their irregularity. And the last slide on case studies is Austria. And here we've seen that basically it's more, we still have to complete the analysis of all the interviews that we have collected so far. But from this first round, we've seen that the problems are mostly with the informal intermediation, so including with co-nationals. Even providing information on legal procedures that is outdated information, it becomes perceived as a scam. And so in trying to find survival strategies and support to navigate the complexity of the system of the host country, migrants incur in this situation. So overall, next slide, please. We basically, going back also to the title of this presentation, which is Intermediaries, Scams and Disappearing Employers, with a question mark. We've seen with this first analysis that there is, of course, an overarching role of intermediaries and networks across status, country, and sector. And that employers are less visible in interviews compared to intermediaries and work intermediaries specifically. And then there's also a variety of actors that are perceived as scammers. There are, again, the temporary employment agencies. There are also public officers and street-level bureaucrats. There are lawyers, private intermediaries, informal intermediaries, including co-nationals. And the last slide, basically, intermediation and perceived scams are really a systematic problem. They're on one hand a way to navigate precarity and irregularity. such as this case in Poland, which is very similar in Poland and UK, where intermediaries suggest how to better scam the state, quote unquote, scam the state. So they try to get student papers to get higher salaries, basically, even though they get more precarious contracts. But also scams are actually a result of a lack of coordination among public institutions and the uncertain procedures and overall of a certain institutional neglect that we're starting to see emerging from the interviews. And I'd like to quote very briefly our interviewee in Italy. His pseudonym is Wally. He says, "I'm sorry to say it, but Italy, in this case, doesn't want to be like this." And he signals basically a straight line with his hands, but it wants you to do like this, this, this. So a zigzag line with his hands. If you want to do things that are in a good way, Italy is going to give you a hard time. And so thank you for your attention. Sorry for taking a bit more time. Looking forward to your comments and answer. And questions, sorry.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for this really rich presentation. I know there was a lot of empirical material in there as well. So if there are questions or if people want to go back to some of those really rich quotes, we can absolutely do that as well. I think we'll start by taking a first round of comments and questions from in the room, if there are, and then we'll go online. Let's just do brief introductions, name and affiliation before a question. Thank you.
My name is Luca Bernasconi. I'm a research assistant at the MPC. I had a sampling related question. So I know that some demographic studies have found that overstayers outnumber irregular entrants, and your findings seem to confirm this in the similarities section. So given that overstayers are maybe more likely or less aware of their irregularity, do you think that there's a non-response bias from irregular entrants, and are they like harder to reach? And then, like, relatedly, do you observe any differences in how brokers interact with overstayers versus irregular entrants? Yeah.
Great, thank you, Luca. Are there any other questions in the room? Yeah, please, Lorenzo.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. My name is Lorenzo Piccoli. I'm a part-time assistant professor at the Migration Policy Center and the School of Transnational Governance. And I have two quick points. The first may be more a comment than a question. I'd be curious to know whether you have a definition for scam, because it seems quite an important concept for this study, but also pretty broad. And I have to confess, I didn't fully understand in what ways public authorities can scam people in a irregular situation. It seems to me mostly that maybe they comply too late with the law, but there is not a deliberate intention to deceive people. Anyways, this was maybe a comment and the question, because again, scam seems to be very central to your presentation today. I was wondering whether there are institutions, organizations, or groups that are used by people to protect themselves against these scams. To my mind, those that come first are, of course, maybe groups of co-nationals. And then the question would be whether for some nationalities this is used more as a resource to protect against scams than for other nationalities. I can also imagine trade unions in some countries and perhaps other groups or associations. So that's a question for you. Thanks again.
Thanks, Lorenzo. And Martin?
Yeah, I'm Martin Rus, based at the EUI here at the Migration Policy Center. I've got, so this is a very interesting project. And so two questions. One is, I mean, the frame you choose to adopt in this paper is one that kind of, I mean, the connotation of a scammer is obviously a negative one. So you basically say that intermediaries are having negative effects, and I'm just wondering if you want to reflect on whether there might actually something positive, or there might be some perceptions of good things that they do. Because in theory, I mean, if they only do bad stuff, then why do they, there might be some reputational effects, and why do migrants use them? Or are there not some good immigration lawyers, or they're not good? So I think a little bit of discussion of kind of nuance and whether or not there might be different types of effects. And my second point is, and we discussed this as well in Zagreb last week. I mean, so in a way, it would be quite a strong finding to say that these things are common across all these different institutional contexts. So I mean, it might be true, but is it not the case that in some countries, particular types of intermediaries play a bigger role, or have different types of effects than in other countries, for example? I'm just wondering about that.
Okay, some pretty rich questions there. Shall we, Leila, you've got your hand up already. Do you want to choose what you want to respond to there?
If you're okay
We'll
with
take
that,
the rest.
Katie.
Absolutely.
Yes. No, I just wanted to answer directly to maybe Lorenzo and Martin. So the definition of scams that we're using, we're basically starting from the point of scams as they are perceived from migrants. So it's migrants themselves that say, we've been cheated, we've been fooled, they've been treating us in a very bad way. So it's from migrants' perspective. It's not something that we've defined yet. It might be definitely useful to find a broader definition also in the literature. It's definitely good advice, and we were thinking to do that, but we started from the empirical material that we have. And basically, this is really more of a research that comes from the data, and this is a trend that we've seen emerging. So what we're doing now is collecting all the data pointing to perceived negative impacts on your life as a regular, irregular, semi-irregular migrant in these sectors and in these countries. And so starting from there, basically we look at mostly at the negative effects or negatively perceived effects of these scams. It would be definitely interesting to look also, again, since these scams come also out of for the case of Austria, for example, we've gathered from interviews, not directly with migrants, but also with NGOs, that it was, it's mostly, it can be also like outdated information that co-nationals give to each other that then lead to problems in becoming, like in pursuing regularization. So in that sense, these are also perceived as scams, but not so intentional somehow. And also, again, also public officers and institutions, they're perceived from the interviewers, and we have several actually in Italy specifically that say that they feel that they've been fooled by police officers over and over, basically, but also from the post office, also from street level bureaucrats at different levels. And this might be, well, because they don't understand well how the system works, but it might be also because there's not enough information going back and forth between the institutions and the migrants themselves. Marta, sorry.
Marta,
if that's
please.
okay. Yes, I would quickly just answer to the question concerning the fact that overstayers outnumber those who try to enter in an irregular fashion. First of all, yes, as I said, I mean, this is a very hard to reach population. So I think that is why such people are also not overrepresented in our research sample. But on the other hand, I think we have to realize as well that people do try to have at least some documents to enter. When depending, when we think about the EU, at least, maybe so the UK is out of the picture a bit here, but Poland was, for example, used as a country of that it was where it was easy until recently to get entry documents. And then people would move forward. They move to a different country with those documents. So we have to think about it exactly in a bigger picture. So when there is a country that allows us to enter in a regular fashion, people will try to do that, even if they realize that later on at some stage they will breach that entry. So.
Thanks, Marta. Do you want to jump in, Rizza? You go.
I think also to tie with the question from Jordanos, maybe I should say that I'm a co-ethnic of those that I interviewed, so it's also a very different process for me. But also at the same time, there's some kind of ambivalence with that, because also to tie with what Martin was saying, like there is an ambivalence with the relationship even within the community. To a certain extent, yes, co-ethnics provide resources, but also at the same time, they are also accepted to be, there's a risk of being scammed by co-ethnic. So those two things are both happening at the same time. So as a researcher, you are also a researcher that is a co-ethnic, you are also met with mistrust in the beginning. So there's really you need to spend a lot of time within the community to gain the trust, of course, and to also make them realize that the project is for them as well. Like and then we also like have interviewees wanting to speak because they were thankful that there is a project, and they are hoping that that would also change not, maybe not their situation, but prevent others from falling into that kind of precarity, being irregularized, and all being cheated or being deceived. And with regards to the nuancing, yes, it also is country specific, but intersecting with the history of a particular migrant community in that country. Because of course, if that has a long history or it's a new wave of migration in that country, then you don't have a particular or not that big of a community first, as opposed to those who have already been in the country for quite some time, and also then develop different kinds of strategies also of profiting from their co-nationals. So there is also that kind of process. Like I think what we found interesting is that kind of duality again. Yes, there was even a quote from the interviewee saying that yes, what caused me to become irregularized was my co-ethnic, but those who helped me also were my co-ethnics. So that kind of ambivalences within the community and within the broader intermediation dynamics.
Thanks, Rizza. We've got some more questions, but if I can also just briefly add, and coming back to Lorenzo and Martin's questions around scam and the potential for good scams. I mean, this word scam, we found it used in different languages, or scam or fake or cheated, or it's always sort of described in the same way, but very concurrently people describe their complete reliance on these scams as the only way that they can stay, also alongside affirming their desire to stay and their sort of you know, I am here to stay. I'm not going to leave. If I'm irregular, I'm irregular, and this is what I've got. And these scams are what make it possible for me to stay. So we are having some really interesting sort of reflexive discussions among us as to how we present these, because precisely as you say, the word scam has a very negative connotation, and the way we're, you know, presenting it here is sort of in line with arguments around, you know, an extension of exploitation of irregular migrant workers. But it is also it's how people survive, and it's, for lack of other choices, it's what people choose to use, or are coerced to use, you could say. But let's take another round of questions. Ettore?
Ettore Recchi, part-time professor, MPC. Thanks for the very insightful presentation. I think it's an important study, especially to highlight the vulnerabilities of a stigmatized population, regular migrants. But I don't know if mine is a comment more than a question, maybe. Exactly in this direction, that is exposing the risk or highlighting the risk of this population. I think, I mean, we are all exposed to scams in the housing market, dealing with bureaucrats, dealing with financial services, wherever, even labor market. So I think what would really push forward the message of this study would be, I mean, this is the victimization study, as I see it, have some sort of benchmarking. If you could benchmark, everybody is exposed to scams. No migrants are exposed to scams. Regular migrants are exposed to scams. Irregular migrants are exposed to scams. So what's the balance between these three populations? It seems that your hypothesis is that irregular migrants are more exposed than other populations to scams, but that's something that should be maybe made more explicit or demonstrated in a more direct way.
Thank you, Ettore. Are there other questions in the room, or there's a few online? I mean, I would just respond. Thank you for the comment, Ettore. And I think another interesting way of doing that benchmarking would also be so to look at policy responses to scams, or, you know, where are people inclined to shut scams down, and for whom, and where do they let them persist, and why? And this also then comes back to what we mentioned briefly in the presentation, this idea we're developing around institutional neglect. And sort of neglect of the issue of the irregular migrant workers face. So that could also be perhaps a way of looking at this benchmarking. We've got a question. Andrew in the room first.
Just following up on a point that Andrew Geddes, I'm based in the MPC, point that Martin made and also Ettore made. It's a very interesting project. So you've got 6 countries, 4 sectors in each country, 24 cases. What I didn't quite pick up was that I got a sense of commonality and convergence, similar dynamics, which seemed to me a very striking finding in 6 highly diverse countries to find such commonality. And I suppose in the material you've got, it'd be interesting, I think, to, you know, I would imagine high levels of divergence, Sweden, Italy, and the different sectors you're looking at. But the point, picking up from what Ettore said, what would be, I suppose, to draw out the distinctiveness of migrant work from work? I mean, in the sectors that you're looking at, I would expect the role, well, I know from my own experience working on gangmaster labour, the role of intermediaries to be very strong for all workers in some sectors. That's how recruitment works. And so the kind of experience of work and the transformation of employment in difficult to observe, difficult to regulate sectors. And so it's kind of just maybe also to draw out the specificity of the migrant experience, which of course can then be highly diverse in terms of the status and position of the migrant workers compared to other workers who are in fairly, well, probably objectively the same conditions in many respects in terms of their exposure to abuse, exploitation, scams, however they're referred to in the workplace. So is that kind of specificity about the experience of employment itself? Because and I fully agree, the sectoral component is really important here as well. So it's just maybe an observation picking up on some of the other comments.
Marta, do you want to respond maybe?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. On the one hand, we tried right now during this presentation to show more the commonalities across status, because we thought that was quite interesting. But what actually, when looking at the different sectors we saw, is that really that was as well something that impacted, that the sector played a very, very important role in, if it was, for example, a sector within that country, like agriculture or elderly care work, yes, the degree to which this sector was part of the informal economy. Even when the migrants themselves had, for example, a regular status, the working conditions they declared were not very good. Yes, of course, the situation of those migrants who were irregularized was even worse. But here I guess you're right that we have to show a certain spectrum, but the overall picture, I mean, it was quite striking that that there was so much commonality in terms of the actual work experience across the different statuses. But thank you so much for this comment, and I'm sure we have to the issues as well here. This is only an analysis of 48 interviews at this stage, so this is still a very small sample from each of the countries, and also we have not that much yet analyzed the Swedish case, which, as you have mentioned, actually you said Sweden, Italy. Yes, there definitely could be quite a lot of striking differences. For now, we see quite a lot of similarities when it comes to the country experiences across Italy, Poland, but also the UK. Austria, not so much. So Sweden probably and Austria might be already in that group of countries that will be more, will show a different experience of migrants.
I think we've got a question online from Sabrina. Do you want to unmute, Sabrina?
Yeah, hello. Thank you so much for this very interesting discussion and the presentations. I'm speaking from what I saw so far from the iClaim project. When it comes to domestic work, I might say that we may find similar phenomena, but actually in our analysis, we're not giving so much emphasis on this particular aspect. So I'm very happy that you are going to work on that, because I think it really deserves a thorough analysis, actually. And in this scenario, my question was about the role of trade unions. Because, you know, when we speak here about the institutional setting, trade unions have this hybrid identity of being on one side part of the institution, on the other side part of the workers' movement, and on the side of the workers. But either way, the problem of lacking of information that Leila before summarized is very much on their shoulders. So how do you handle the role of? How did you handle the role of trade unions? So how did you include them in the stakeholders? Did you include them in the the subject that you're going to criticize at the end of the research as the institutional side, or what?
Leila, do you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you so much, Sabrina. I'm very glad that we're doing similar work, but also on, tackling different topics. So trade unions, since for Prime research, we've also interviewed trade unions among the policy actors that we've interviewed. So there's also employers associations and, NGOs supporting migrants, regular and irregular. But trade unions, when we look at them through the eyes of our interviewees, meaning the migrants, they're not there that much. I mean, migrants don't rely on trade unions. They're not part of their everyday life. They're not part of their complaint mechanism system. It's not, they're not actors to which people rely, basically. The only exception, I think, in Italy is for trade unions in for people that work in the agricultural sector. But this is not for like to get support for more information or directly to come up with claims of regularization based on exploitation. This is a very low percentage. It's mostly to get unemployment benefits at the end of their season, basically. So that's the only time in which trade unions can actually map migrants working in the agricultural sector, but this has nothing to do with the fully irregular migrants that are very rarely covered and intercepted by trade unions. But again, since people go in and out of irregularity, which is also one of the key findings of our research, I think that at some point people might interact with trade unions, but don't necessarily find them as useful as we might think, or we would like to see them useful. And Marta, sorry.
Yeah, just to continue a little bit, I think here we can find as well quite interesting country differences in terms of how trade unions function, but to what extent they are actually developed, as well in their idea of to actually include foreign workers into their ranks, and what comes actually in the Polish case, at least, to the fore is as well that on the one hand, as Leila said, that very often people are unwilling actually, or not interested, or don't have the time, or don't even know that such things exist. But this is as well, it seems at least linked as well to be a bit nationality specific, yes? For example, because migrants from Ukraine seem to be rather skeptical and do not place so much trust into institutional solutions, at least in Poland. I don't know, it could be interesting to see whether that differs, for example, in Italy. But migrants who only recently arrived to Poland from Latin America somehow immediately found their way to also a trade union and have already a special a branch actually dedicated to workers from Latin America. So a completely different dynamic in terms of a response of workers who feel that their rights are being somehow, yes, abused.
Thanks, Marta. We've got two more questions in the room. We'll go to Martin and then Andrew.
Mine is just a reflection, kind of listening to all the comments. So I think what could be really interesting actually is that, if I understand correctly, this whole idea of scams is something that has come out of the data in a way, that people have been talking about that. And so I'm not so sure anymore but you might want to think about the relationship between scams and intermediaries, because I think maybe scams is more like scamming is more the central concept. And then, as you also mentioned, migrants are not only the victims, or citizens are only the victims, but they're also you can scam the state, right? So it's a scamming of the state, scamming of the citizens, scamming of the migrants. And I like Edre's point about that everybody feels a bit insecure. So I, as a kind of regular privileged migrant EU citizen in Italy, receive a phone call every other day from some electricity company that wants to convince me to do something, which is probably a scam. So I think this idea of scamming resonates with people. But then when you think about scamming the state in a way, then the immediate hypothesis would be that this must vary a lot across countries, because the way to scam the Swedish state is probably quite different from this way to scam the Italian state, because just institutionally they look very different. There's different opportunities, but in a way, it might be worth thinking a little more, developing that concept theoretically a bit more. What is a scam? How do we think of it? How do we define it? and where are the different entry points in terms of the analysis?
Really helpful. Thank you, Martin. Let's go online. There's a question from Minka Hajar online.
Yes, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I had a question regarding maybe the ethical considerations of writing about scams. So I work on the iClaim project, and we also encounter a lot of stories about scams, and we are actively thinking about, like, should we write about this? Because writing about a scam and people being victim about a scam also can potentially give away about the mechanisms that exist of circumventing certain policies or rules. And I was very curious to hear what your thoughts are on that, and whether you have ideas or help for me also about that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we did have a lot of discussions concerning how do we actually frame this so that it has like several kind of iterations. We still don't have an answer, and that's why it's helpful to actually present it to hear and also test the water. Can we actually do it? Can we actually write about it? And if we will write about it, how do we frame it in such a way that you also do not put migrants themselves at risk, but also at the same time, we find it so pervasive that to a certain extent, scamming is also one of the ways or one of the pathways towards irregularization. And it's there, at least for certain countries, that it's strong, and it's very much embedded and structured the way people access work and the way they remain to have jobs, and the acceptance that that is a necessary part to stay and to also find jobs in a particular country or even to reach that country. Because for some, this kind of scams take place even before they reach the destination country. And so it is for that reason that we sort of think about scamming and intermediaries, but we also might need to think about whether it would be the concept of scamming that we should highlight. And yeah, so like presenting it to a larger audience is some sort of a test case to what extent we can actually do this, and what will be the sort of safe way of doing it. But also not writing about it, it has also a certain kind of, okay, are we, because you find interviewees also asking for, oh, I hope you write something about this, so that people would know, so that they will be informed, so that they will not experience what I experienced. And if you get those kinds of comments from your from your interviewees, then okay, then maybe we should. So I understand the dilemma. We are also in that kind of situation.
And I think it's also just about figuring out what it is we want to say about scams. And it's not about saying, this scam is taking place between this individual, and therefore this is being produced. But it's, why is there a scam here? Or why has this scam not been stopped? Or what gap is this plugging that isn't being plugged by other actors that we think might be filling this gap normally? And also then sort of recentering attention on where the problem in all of this is. As we started off saying at the beginning, the vast majority of people that we've met have been regular or semi-regular at some point, and it's because of processes like this that they're being pushed into irregularization, and that's not being addressed at any other kind of structural level. So that's where this kind of gap emerges. So I think the trick is to find the way of saying, like, what does the scam do? And how does that then, how do we understand it in that way, rather than, as you say, it's very important to be very sensitive to all of this data and what it could expose. I think, Marta, do you want to just briefly contribute? And then we've got a couple more comments in the room.
I just quickly, one more sentence, because one of the questions we asked during the interview as well is for migrants' recommendations, how they would like to change, what should change, or what could change actually their situation, or the situation of people in irregularized with irregularized statuses, and it came very strongly to the fore, where they said, okay, we want to have information that is reliable. Yes, we want to know what to do. We don't want to end up in such a situation as we are right now. And very often this was based on their stories, where exactly they felt that they have been cheated or misinformed, whether on purpose or not. Yes, so I think, so if they themselves give this as a recommendation, I don't think we really, I mean, we have to really think how to give that recommendation further, so to say. Yeah.
Thanks, Marta. We're almost out of time, but we've just got a couple more comments in the room.
Hi, Tobias from MPC. I was thinking about, okay, if I was an intermediary, I would perceive myself as trying to scam somehow the government or the I don't know, authorities, as well as scamming the migrants with whom I run some kind of scheme. And I think trying to figure out where these intermediaries sit might be interesting, and whether or not that is actually the case, or whether I'm trying to help immigrants scam the government, and whether or not the interests of the intermediaries, which role they play. And I think in order to define scamming and also the loss of trust that you allude to in the title, I think it would be nice to write down what the expectations are that people have that interact with authorities or the intermediaries, how people formed these expectations, and in which way these expectations are somehow violated and broken, because that's then the loss of trust, I think. And I think that would make the whole argument clear.
Thanks so much. Sorry. I was just going to,
because the extent to which the quantitative data you have might allow you to look at some of these questions around trust and efficacy, because they seem quite important in people's engagement with institutions, because I'd imagine you might have quite low levels of trust in institutions, and yet the expectation is you engage with institutions. So trust and efficacy might be, but I don't know if the quantitative data allows you to look at that. But it might be quite interesting to try and see how that interacts with your qualitative.
These are both really helpful ideas to take forwards. Leila, Marta, any last words? No from Leila? Marta?
I think this is actually because we have quantitative data with telling us about the experiences of migrants. So I think it's actually a good idea to include this as a certain background, and to so to say reinforce certain ideas. But I just wanted to say, because you said, okay, the intermediary is between the migrant and the state, but at the same time, the intermediaries, actually, we forgot about this employer, yes, so to say, disappearing employer. And very often, this is as well what Caitlin said about this gap. Employers, it seems, at least in some of the country cases, they're more and more afraid, actually, to be directly responsible for their migrant workers. So that's why the intermediaries step in. And so that's why it's not quite clear who is employing whom, who is responsible for which papers. I mean, this, again, it shifts the responsibilities. So I think this is another actor who is here. And this is a very important question, is why there is such a need for these intermediaries. Yes, what is the overall as well atmosphere, so to say, around employing foreign workers in the given countries? So yeah.
Thank you, Marta. Okay, we're past 4 o'clock, so I think we need to close it there. But huge thanks to Rizza, Marta, and Leila. I've had the lovely job of chairing this without having to do the presenting. And thank you to everybody for being here. The seminar is recorded and there'll be a recording made available online. There was a question about that in the chat. But thanks everyone very much for joining us, and we'll see you at the next seminar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.